The silence in the great hall was different from any other silence. It wasn't empty. It was full. Full of ghosts of music, of the faint smell of expensive perfume and old paper, and the sharp, clean scent of lemon polish that clung to the air like a memory. This was the girl's world. The world she inherited when the last of the fancy-dressed people had left and the heavy doors were locked for the night. She was 16, and her official title was cleaner's assistant, a role that mostly meant being her mother's shadow. Her mother, a woman whose tired eyes held a lifetime of hard work, moved with a practiced efficiency. She pushed the large, noisy buffer machine across the marble floors of the lobby, its mechanical hum, a stark contrast to the delicate music that had filled the space just hours before. The girl's job was quieter, more intimate. She carried a soft cloth and a small bucket, and her domain was the concert hall itself. She moved from row to row, gently wiping down the velvet seats. Each one was still warm, as if holding onto the body that had sat there. She'd find a dropped program, a lost glove, a single lonely earring glinting under a seat. These were the little treasures left behind by the other world, the world of light and applause, a world where she was invisible. She didn't mind being invisible. Invisibility was a kind of superpower in a place like this. It meant she could see and hear everything without being seen herself. She knew which spot in the third row had the best acoustics for the cello. She knew that the conductor always tapped his baton on the podium 3 times before a performance. A quick, nervous rhythm that only she, from her hiding place in the highest balcony, ever seemed to notice. She knew music not from books, but from feeling. She had never had a lesson in her life. Her family couldn't have afforded such a thing even if they had known she needed it. Her education happened in the shadows, when she was supposed to be sweeping up popcorn. She remembered the first time it really happened. She was maybe 13, small for her age, tasked with cleaning the lower levels after a student recital. She had finished early, and on a whim, had slipped through a heavy curtain and found herself in the wings of the stage. The hall was dark, save for a single work light illuminating a grand piano. A young man, no older than the ones she went to school with, sat at the bench. He looked nervous. He played a piece she didn't know, full of fast, complicated notes. He played it perfectly, without a single mistake. But it felt hollow. It was like looking at a beautifully painted picture of a fire, but feeling no heat. Then he stopped, shook his head, and started again. This time he missed a note, fumbled a chord, and in that small human error, something broke through. For a second she felt his frustration, his desire. The music became real. From that day on, she was a student of the soul of the music, not just the notes. Her mother would sometimes hum while she worked, old folk tunes from a country the girl had never seen. The girl would hum along, and her mother would smile, a rare, beautiful thing that crinkled the corners of her tired eyes. "You have a good ear," her mother would say, not understanding the half of it. The girl didn't just have a good ear. She had a library inside her head. She could remember a melody she had heard only once, replaying it in her mind until she understood its shape, its colors, its secrets. She could hear the sadness in a violin's sigh, the joy in a flute's trill, the argument between the brass section. It was a language more real to her than the one she spoke at school. Her nightly ritual always ended the same way. After the last seat was wiped and the last program was neatly stacked, she would stand at the back of the hall in the deepest shadow and just look at the stage. It was a kingdom, and the throne was the grand piano that sat center stage. It was a massive, gleaming black creature, elegant and powerful. Under the bright spotlights, it looked like it was carved from a piece of the night sky. To the daytime people, it was an instrument. To her, it was a living thing, a sleeping giant that held all the stories, all the joy and sorrow that she had ever felt. Her mother would call out, her voice echoing slightly, "Ready, child?" And the girl would nod, even though her mother couldn't see her. She would give the piano one last longing glance before turning to leave. But tonight was different. Her mother had finished early and had to go help a colleague who had sprained an ankle in the kitchen. "Lock up when you're done," she had said, handing the girl the heavy ornate key. "Be quick." The weight of the key in her hand felt different. It felt like a responsibility, but also like a permission. She finished her work, her movements slower than usual. The silence of the hall seemed to press in on her, thicker, more meaningful. She didn't leave. She stood there for a long time, just breathing in the air of a place that was hers, if only for a few stolen hours. Her feet, as if with a mind of their own, began to carry her down the aisle. She didn't walk on the carpeted path. She walked on the cold, smooth stone beside the seats, her soft-soled shoes making no sound. She was a ghost in her own story. She walked past the empty orchestra pit, a dark cavern waiting for its players. She climbed the few steps to the stage itself, her heart starting to beat a little faster, a nervous drum against her ribs. The wood of the stage felt solid and real under her feet. She walked towards the piano, drawn by a force she couldn't name. She stopped just a few feet away, close enough to see her own reflection in its polished black surface, a small, blurry figure in a simple gray uniform, looking at a king. She didn't dare touch it, not yet. She just stood there in the middle of the vast, empty hall and listened. She listened to the silence, and for the first time, she thought she could hear the music it was holding, waiting for someone to let it out. The next day, the great hall woke up. It was a slow, groggy process, like a giant stirring from a deep sleep. The silence was the first thing to go, chased away by the clatter of chairs being set out, the low murmur of voices, the heavy thud of a delivery trunk being dropped by the stage door. The girl and her mother worked quickly, trying to erase the night and make the hall pristine for the daytime people. Her mother polished the floors until they gleamed like a dark mirror, while the girl made sure every single surface was free of dust. She worked with a special care today because she knew who was coming. His name was spoken in whispers, even by the teachers. He was a legend, a musician who had traveled the world and whose opinion could make a career or shatter one. He was here to give a masterclass, and the air was thick with a nervous energy that felt like electricity, just before a storm. When the daytime people started to arrive, the girl and her mother slipped away to their small closet-like office in the basement. But the girl couldn't stay there. She found an excuse to go back up, carrying a bucket of water as if she had forgotten to clean a spot near the back. She found her usual hiding place, a small alcove shadowed by a heavy velvet curtain, where she could see everything without being seen. The hall was filling up now. The most advanced students from the conservatory sat in the front rows, their backs straight, their faces pale. Behind them were the teachers, their expressions a mixture of pride and fear. In the very back, a few serious-looking men and women with notepads sat down, the critics. The people who wrote for the newspapers and could make a musician famous with a single sentence. Then, a hush fell over the crowd. A man had walked in from a side door. He wasn't particularly tall, but he filled the room. His hair was white and wild like a storm cloud, and he wore a simple, dark suit that seemed out of place among the fancier clothes. But it was his face that held everyone's attention. It was a roadmap of a life lived with intensity, with deep lines around his eyes and a mouth that was set in a firm, unforgiving line. This was the maestro. He didn't smile or nod. He simply walked down the aisle, his gaze sweeping across the room. And every person he looked at felt as if he could see right through them, into their very soul. He took a seat in the front row, next to the director of the conservatory, and stared at the empty stage. The first student was called. He was a young man with trembling hands who walked to the piano as if he were heading to his own execution. He sat down, took a deep breath, and began to play. The piece was complicated, full of fast runs and intricate chords. The girl watched his fingers fly across the keys, a blur of motion. It was impressive. From the back of the hall, she could hear the technical perfection. The way every note was in its place, like a line of perfectly arranged soldiers. But she also heard what was missing. It was the same thing she had heard years ago from the wings. The music was beautiful, like a perfect glass sculpture, but it was cold. There was no life in it, no story, no feeling. It was just noise, perfectly executed. When the young man finished, there was a moment of tense silence. The maestro did not applaud. He just sat there, his eyes closed. Then he stood up and walked slowly onto the stage. The young man flinched as the maestro stood behind him. "No, the maestro said, his voice not loud but carrying to every corner of the hall. It was a voice used to being obeyed. You have played the notes. You have not played the music. He began to pace back and forth behind the piano. Your fingers are like machines. They do what they are told. But where are you in this music? Where is your heart? Where is your pain? Where is your joy? This piece, he gestured at the sheet music, is not just a collection of dots on a page. It is a cry from the soul of the man who wrote it. He was in love. He was heartbroken. He was looking at the stars and feeling so small and so big at the same time. And you have given me a math problem. The young man shrunk in his seat. The maestro's words were like stones. Again, he commanded. The young man started again, his fingers now shaking so badly he almost missed a note. Stop, the maestro shouted, making the young man jump. Stop. You are thinking too much. You are thinking about the next note, the next chord. You must not think. You must feel. Do you feel anything? Or are you just a robot? The girl in the shadows felt a pang of sympathy for the student. She knew he was trying his best, but she also understood the maestro's frustration. It was the frustration of a man who could see a beautiful painting and was angry that no one else could see its colors. The maestro let the student go, dismissing him with a wave of his hand. The young man practically fled the stage, his face red with shame. The maestro stood there for a long moment, his back to the audience. His shoulders slumped with a weariness that went deeper than just a long day. He looked like a man fighting a losing battle against a world of mediocrity. Then he seemed to gather himself. He turned to face the room, his eyes burning with a new fire. You all listen, he said, his voice now booming. You all think that if you play the right notes at the right time, with the right volume, that you are a musician. You are wrong. You are a technician. A music box can do that. A machine can do that. He strode to the piano and sat down on the bench with an angry thump. The entire hall leaned forward. He was going to show them. He placed his long, pale fingers on the keys. He didn't play a complicated tune. He played a single, deep chord that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. Then he let his right hand fall gently on one key, a single note, a C sharp. The sound that came out was not just a sound. It was a story. It held a universe of feeling. It was the sound of loneliness and of hope. It was a question asked in the dark. It hung in the air, shimmering and alive, long after his finger had lifted from the key. The silence that followed was even more profound than the one before. It was a silence filled with the ghost of that one perfect note. That, the maestro said, his voice now a low, intense whisper that was more powerful than any shout, is a note. That note has a voice. It has a past and a future. It breathes. Can any of you do that? Can any of you make one single note sing? He looked out at the terrified faces in the front row. He shook his head, a look of deep disappointment on his face. No, he said to himself, more than to them, none of you. You have forgotten how to listen. He stood up, his frustration boiling over. He pointed a finger at the young man who was still trying to slip away. You come back here. The young man froze. You see this key? The maestro said, his finger hovering over the C sharp. This note is more important than all the thousands of notes you just played. Because this note has a soul. And you have given me nothing but an empty shell. He turned away from the piano, disgusted, ready to storm off the stage and leave them all with their failure. But in his anger, he was careless. He turned his back for just a second, to berate the director for the poor quality of his students. And in that one unguarded second, the world was about to change. The air in the great hall was heavy, thick with the maestro's disappointment. It was a physical thing, pressing down on the shoulders of every student and teacher. The young man who had been on stage was now slumped in his seat in the front row, his face buried in his hands. The maestro stood with his back to the piano, a silhouette of frustration against the bright stage lights. He was lecturing the director of the conservatory, his voice a low, angry growl that didn't need a microphone to be heard. This is what you are teaching them? To be perfect little machines? To have no blood in their veins? You are creating statues, not artists. From her hiding place in the wings, the girl watched it all. Her heart was beating a fast, nervous rhythm against her ribs. She wasn't afraid of the maestro's anger. She was used to loud, frustrated voices, but she was affected by his sadness. Underneath all the shouting and the sternness, she could hear it, a deep, weary sadness, like the sound of a far-off train in the night. He wasn't just angry at the students. He was grieving for the music he felt was being lost. He had played that one note, that beautiful, lonely C-sharp, and it had been a challenge. He had thrown a perfect diamond on the stage and dared anyone to show him they understood its worth. And no one could. Her eyes were fixed on the piano. The key he had pressed, the C-sharp, seemed to still be glowing with a faint inner light. She could almost see it vibrating, the sound hanging in the air like an invisible thread. The maestro had called it a question. To her, it felt more like a cry. It was the sound of all the lonely things in the world, a single streetlight on an empty road, the last leaf on a tree in autumn, the feeling of being in a room full of people and feeling completely alone. She had felt that feeling her whole life. She knew that sound. The maestro, still scolding the director, took a step away from the piano, turning his full body towards the man in the front row. He was completely absorbed in his lecture, his back now completely turned to the instrument. The stage was empty. The piano was alone. And in that moment, something inside the girl shifted. It wasn't a thought. It wasn't a plan. It was an impulse, pure and simple, like the need to take a breath. It was as if the note itself had reached out across the vast, silent hall, and it touched her. It had asked its question, and she felt the only thing in the world to do was to answer it. She didn't think about the consequences. She didn't think about the hundreds of eyes in the room. She didn't think about her mother waiting in the basement. In that second, there was only her and the piano and the lonely hanging sound. She took a step out from the heavy velvet curtain. Her soft-soled shoe made no sound on the wooden floor of the stage. Another step. She was now in the light, but no one saw her. Every person in that room was focused on the drama unfolding between the maestro and the director. She was a ghost, walking in plain sight. She reached the piano. It was even more beautiful up close. The black lacquer was so deep and shiny, she could see her own distorted reflection looking back at her. A small, pale girl with wide, dark eyes. She could feel the warmth coming from the strings inside, a leftover heat from the maestro's angry chord. Her hand, which felt small and dirty compared to the gleaming perfection of the instrument, began to rise. It moved slowly, as if through water. She saw the calluses on her fingertips from scrubbing floors, the dirt under her fingernails that no amount of soap seemed to remove. This hand, this cleaner's hand, was about to touch the king of instruments. Her finger. The index finger of her right hand hovered over the C-sharp key. She could feel the vibration still humming in the air around it. She wasn't trying to copy the maestro. She couldn't have if she tried. His note had been a declaration, a statement of power from a master of his craft. Hers would be different. She closed her eyes for a split second, not to think, but to feel. She thought of the quiet halls at night, the smell of lemon polish, the feeling of being invisible. She thought of the sad songs her mother hummed, the hope she felt when she looked at the stars through the tall windows of the hall. She poured all of it, all the quiet feelings of her entire life, into the tip of her finger, and she touched the key. She didn't press it down. She simply let her finger rest on it, letting her own weight and the weight of all her unspoken feelings do the work. The sound that came out was not loud. It was not forceful. But it was the clearest, purest sound that anyone in that room had ever heard. It was like a single drop of perfect, clean water falling into a still pool. It was like the sound of a small silver bell ringing in a snow-covered forest. It held a sadness so deep it felt ancient, but it also held a tiny, fragile spark of hope. It was the sound of a question being answered, not with another question, but with understanding. It was a voice, and it said, "I hear you." The note hung in the air, and the world stopped. The maestro, in the middle of a sentence, froze. His mouth stayed open, but no words came out. His lecture died on his lips. The director of the conservatory stared at him, then at the piano, his face a mask of confusion. The students in the front row, who had been looking down at their shoes in shame, all looked up at once, their heads turning in unison. The critics in the back, who had been scribbling notes, all put their pens down. The silence that followed the girl's note was not empty. It was full. It was full of a sound so full of feeling that it seemed to suck all the other air out of the room. For 10 long seconds, no one moved. No one breathed. The only thing that existed was the fading echo of that one perfect, impossible note. Then, like a statue coming to life, the maestro began to turn. His movements were slow, stiff, as if he were in a dream. His angry expression was gone, replaced by one of utter, total bewilderment. His eyes scanned the empty stage, looking for a ghost, for a trick, for anything that could explain what he had just heard. His gaze passed over the piano, then swept across the wings. And then it found her. She was still standing there, her hand hovering over the keys, her eyes wide with the terror that was just now catching up to her. The spell was broken. She was no longer invisible. The whole world was looking at her. The great maestro, the man whose voice could shake the foundations of the hall, was staring at her, his face a canvas of shock and disbelief. He took a step towards her, his mouth opening and closing, searching for a question that his mind couldn't yet form. The silence was broken by a single, whispered word that seemed to come from the very soul of the man. What? The silence that followed the note was a living thing. It wasn't the quiet of an empty room. It was the quiet of a held breath, a shared moment of impossibility that hung in the air thicker than any fog. For the girl, the world had shrunk to the size of a pinhole, and at the center of that pinhole was the maestro's face. His anger, which had been a terrifying storm just moments before, had vanished. In its place was a look of such profound, naked confusion that it was somehow more frightening. His eyes, which had been sharp and critical, were now wide and searching, as if he were looking at a ghost or an angel that had just descended from the ceiling. Her own body felt frozen, statue carved from ice. The blood had drained from her face, and she could feel a cold sweat on her forehead. Her hand was still hovering over the keys, trembling slightly. She wanted to pull it back, to run, to melt back into the shadows from which she had come, but her limbs refused to obey. The impulse that had carried her to the piano had abandoned her, leaving her stranded in the light, exposed and alone. The hundreds of eyes that were now fixed on her felt like a physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders, pinning her to the spot. She was no longer a ghost. She was the spectacle, and she had never felt more terrified in her life. The maestro took a step. It was not his usual angry, stomping stride. It was slow, careful, almost reverent, as if he were walking on sacred ground that might crumble under his feet. He moved around the piano, his eyes never leaving her. He was a man who had spent his life surrounded by the world's greatest talents. A man who believed he had heard every sound a human could make. But this was something else. It was a sound that didn't belong in this world of practice and perfection. It was a sound that came from a place he had only read about in books, a place of pure, untaught emotion. His analytical mind, the mind that could deconstruct a symphony into its smallest parts, was struggling to find an explanation. Was it a trick? A hidden speaker? A strange acoustical anomaly? But as he got closer, he saw the truth in her eyes. The fear was real. The shock was real. The sound had come from her. A low murmur began to ripple through the audience. It started as a few confused whispers and grew into a wave of sound. Who is that? Where did she come from? Is she a new student? Then, a voice from the back, a teacher who had seen her 100 times, said it aloud. That's the cleaner's girl. The word spread like wildfire, and the confusion turned to disbelief. The girl in the simple gray uniform, the girl who was supposed to be invisible, was the source of the sound that had stopped the maestro in his tracks. The critics in the back row were no longer just watching. They were writing, their pens flying across their notepads, capturing a story that was far more incredible than any review they had planned to write. The maestro finally reached her. He stopped just a few feet away, close enough that she could see the fine lines around his eyes. the shock of white in his eyebrows. He was a giant, and she felt impossibly small. He looked from her terrified face to her hand, still hovering over the keys, and back again. He opened his mouth, and for a second she thought he would shout, that he would call for security to drag her away. But instead, his voice came out as a hoarse, quiet whisper, stripped of all its former power. "Who?" he asked, his voice filled with a wonder that was almost childlike. "Are you?" The question broke the spell. She couldn't answer. What could she say? She was no one. She was the cleaner's girl. She was the one who wiped the seats and swept the floors. She had no name in this world, no identity that mattered. She just stared at him, her mouth slightly open, unable to form a single word. Her silence was her only answer. Just then, a new voice cut through the tension, a voice filled with panic. Get away from her. It was her mother. She had heard the whispers, had felt the change in the atmosphere, and had come running up from the basement. She stood at the edge of the stage, her cleaning bucket still in her hand, her face a mask of maternal fear. She didn't understand the music, or the silence, or the maestro's expression. All she saw was a powerful, angry-looking man towering over her daughter, who looked as if she were about to be eaten alive. She ran onto the stage, putting herself between the girl and the maestro, a fierce protective lioness guarding her cub. Leave her alone. She hasn't done anything. The director of the conservatory finally found his voice. He stormed onto the stage, his face red with embarrassment and anger. This is an outrage. A complete breach of security. Who let this child on the stage? He looked at the girl's mother with disgust. You are both fired. I'm calling security to have you removed immediately. He saw a rule that had been broken, a disruption to his orderly world. He wanted it erased. But the maestro didn't even look at the director. He held up a single hand, a gesture that was so simple and yet so absolute that the director stopped mid-sentence. The maestro's gaze was still fixed on the girl, who was now hiding behind her mother, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. He ignored the protests of the director, the frightened pleas of the mother, and the murmurs of the crowd. In that moment, the only thing that mattered in the entire world was the source of that one impossible note. He looked at the girl, and his expression softened. The harshness was gone, replaced by a look of profound discovery, as if a cartographer had just found a new continent. No one is being fired, the maestro said, his voice now firm and clear, but without its earlier anger. He looked at the director, and his eyes held a warning. No one will touch her. She is not a rule breaker. She is a mystery. And she, he said, turning back to the trembling girl, is coming with me. He held out a hand to her, not to grab her, but as an invitation. It was a gesture that changed everything. He wasn't punishing her. He was claiming her. The entire hall watched, breathless, as the cleaner's girl, the ghost of the concert hall, hesitantly reached out her small, calloused hand and took the maestro's. The walk from the stage was the longest walk of the girl's life. The maestro's hand was wrapped around hers, his grip firm but not rough. It was an anchor in a sea of chaos. Behind her, she could hear the director sputtering, his voice full of indignation. But it sounded distant, like someone shouting from another room. She could hear her mother's frantic footsteps following them, her mother's voice calling her name, a sound filled with a fear she understood, but she couldn't turn back. The maestro was pulling her forward through a side door and into a long, quiet corridor, away from the stairs and the whispers. The heavy door swung shut behind them, and the noise of the concert hall was cut off. Leaving them in a muffled silence, he didn't speak. He just led her down the corridor, his steps purposeful. She had to hurry to keep up, her small legs moving twice as fast as his. She looked at their joined hands. His was large and pale, with long, elegant fingers that were famous the world over. Hers was small and tanned, the knuckles red from scrubbing, the nails short and clean but unpolished. They looked like they belonged to two different species, yet here they were, connected. He led her not to a grand office, but to a small, plain door at the end of the hall. He unlocked it with a key from his pocket and ushered her inside. It was a practice room, a small one. Unlike the grand stage, This room was humble and worn. There was a piano in the corner, an upright model that looked like it had been played 1,000 times. The walls were lined with shelves full of sheet music, some of it yellowed with age. A single window looked out onto a brick wall. It was a room for work, not for show. The maestro let go of her hand and closed the door, shutting out the world. He gestured for her to sit on a small, worn wooden bench against the wall. He remained standing, looking down at her, his expression still one of deep, searching wonder. "Now," he said, his voice quiet and calm. "Tell me." He didn't specify what he wanted her to tell him. He just stood there, waiting. The girl looked at her hands in her lap. She didn't know what to say. How could she explain something she didn't understand herself? I don't know," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "I just heard it, the note," he said, clarifying. "The note I played." "What did you hear?" She thought for a moment, trying to find the right words. "It was alone," she said finally. "It was like being the last person left in a big, dark room. It was asking if anyone was there." The maestro nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. "And your note? What was that saying?" She shrugged, a small, helpless gesture. It was saying, "I'm here. I heard you." He was silent for a long time after that. He walked over to the upright piano and sat on the bench. He didn't play anything complicated. He played a simple melody, a folk tune from his own childhood, a song his mother used to sing to him. It was a gentle, sad little song. When he finished, he turned to her. "Don't tell me the name of that song. Tell me what color it is." The girl didn't hesitate. "It's gray," she said. "Like the sky just before it rains. And a little bit yellow like a lamp in a window far away." The maestro's breath caught in his throat. He had never told anyone about the colors he saw in music. It was his own private secret, a strange synesthesia that he had learned to hide. And this girl, this child who had never had a lesson in her life, had just described it perfectly. He played another piece. This one, a frantic, chaotic composition from a modern composer. It was full of sharp, jarring notes and sudden stops. "And this one?" he asked, his voice a little unsteady. "It's not a color," she said after a moment. "It's a feeling. It's like being in a crowd of people who are all shouting at once. It's red and black, and it makes my stomach feel tight." He felt a chill go down his spine. He was no longer in the presence of a mystery. He was in the presence of a miracle. He stood up and began to pace the small room, his mind racing. All his life, he had been searching for this. He had traveled the world, taught the most gifted students, and he had always been disappointed. He had been trying to teach them how to put feeling into the music, but he realized now that he had been going about it all wrong. You can't teach feeling. You can only uncover what is already there. This girl had no walls, no preconceived notions, no technical training to get in the way. She was a pure vessel. He stopped pacing and looked at her. She was watching him, her fear slowly being replaced by a quiet curiosity. He walked back to the piano and played a long, complex piece, a sonata full of sorrow and struggle, which ended in a mood of profound peace and acceptance. He poured all of his skill, all of his life experience into the performance. The room was filled with the sound. When he finished, the silence was heavy with emotion. He turned to her, his eyes intense. "I am not going to ask you to play that back," he said. "I want you to do something else. I want you to play me the feeling of the very last chord of that piece. Not the chord itself, but the feeling it leaves behind." The girl closed her eyes. She wasn't thinking about notes or keys. She was thinking about the story the music had told. She thought about the struggle, and then the quiet release at the end. She thought about the feeling of a heavy burden being lifted, of the sun coming out after a long storm. She reached out and placed her fingers on the keys. She didn't play a melody. She played a series of simple, quiet chords, spaced apart, like slow, deep breaths. The sound was not complicated, but it was filled with a warmth and a peace that was so real it was almost tangible. It was the sound of forgiveness, of rest, of home. The maestro closed his eyes. He felt the tears welling up behind his eyelids. He, a man who had not cried in 30 years, felt his heart break open. In that moment, he knew. He knew he would not be going on his world tour. He knew he would not be teaching at the most prestigious conservatories in Europe. He had found something more important. He had found the reason he had become a musician in the first place. He walked to the phone on the wall and made a call. He canceled everything. All his engagements for the next 6 months. The person on the other end of the line was shocked, but the maestro was firm. He had found a new student, and she was going to be his only one. The next day, the girl and the maestro were back in the small practice room. Her mother had been given a new job as the caretaker of this small building, a job with better pay and a small apartment attached. The girl was no longer a cleaner's assistant. She was a student. The maestro sat beside her at the upright piano. He opened a book to the first page. It was full of simple scales. C major, D minor. He pointed to the first note. "This is C," he said, his voice gentle. "But you already knew that, didn't you?" She looked at the dots on the page, then at the keys, and then at him. And for the first time, she smiled. The music world had stopped that day, but for them,